Good morning. This practice this morning is a bit more of a teaching workshop-y type of lab practice. It's inspired by a client of mine who actually had some increase of pain from doing an exercise and ways to discover and sort of solve your pain puzzle when something isn't quite working. Yeah? So I've got a bolster, a block, a strap, and as well as a TheraBand. Now, the exercise that was difficult for her was one that I've shown commonly on this practice, which is ankle to knee with a TheraBand around the leg and then pushing the leg bone out into the strap. So the idea of the movement is that we're meant to be moving the leg bone here in the hip socket. Whoops, and his foot's a little bit messed up here. So is his knee. Let's get his knee in a better place. All right, so then we're here. So then the movement is coming from this leg bone in the hip socket. Now sometimes when we have this leg bone moving in the hip socket, rather than just this leg bone moving in the hip socket, all sorts of other stuff can happen. Sometimes it is very obvious what is happening, and other times it's not so obvious. And so part of this practice is help to bring what is not obvious, obvious. And the reason for this is because we can't solve anything that is under our level of awareness, which is what I have found to be one of the biggest determinants of people helping themselves solve their pain puzzle and reduce and eradicate their pain is becoming aware of that which they're not aware of, which is tricky, right? Because how do you determine that? So when it comes to this movement of ankle to knee, and you're pressing that leg wide, one of the key things that people often do is they press down with the opposite foot without knowing it. So with this ankle up here, they press away, but they're inadvertently pressing with this foot down onto the floor, and inadvertently their pelvis is shifting. So as they move this leg wide, or into the rotation rather, their pelvis starts to shift, even just a little bit. But that can put some strain up into the tissue between the pelvis, the top of the pelvis and the rib cage. That can put some strain in around the rib cage, around the spine. So if you're finding that to be the case, then simply play with this as an initial trial. Ankle strap comes around your leg, and then the leg bone moves, and really watch your other foot. With your other foot, notice if you're increasing any pressure going down into the floor or pushing out away from you or anything else at all. So that when you're doing the movement here, these hip flexors are quiet. The muscles that are contracting are back here, but they're not, the other leg is not pushing into the floor to stabilize. So maybe the movement that you're doing is going to become a little bit smaller. Okay? Now another thing that can happen is as we set up the position to bring the ankle to the knee, oftentimes the pelvis moves right there and then. And so the leg bone, the intent has been for the leg bone to come up onto, or the ankle to come up onto the knee and to have the rotation through that leg bone. But what ends up happening is the pelvis does the shifting. So if I show this to you in a standing position, then what happens is the leg bone comes on up, ankle comes to the knee, but instead of the pelvis staying quiet, the pelvis shifts. Now many people will say, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that the intent is to move the leg bone in the hip socket. The intent is to improve how this leg bone is moving relative to the pelvis. But in fact, what's happening is the pelvis is moving relative to the rib cage, and there's no movement happening here at all. It's one of the biggest, most common things I see with people who have QL issues and who also have hip issues, is that when we can get their leg bone moving better in their hip socket, their QL issues basically vanish. So showing this with an actual pelvis, then what this looks like is the ankle comes up onto the knee, not with the pelvis staying quiet, but the pelvis doing this. So you can see the orientation of what's happening between the pelvis and the rib cage. Right? Okay, so that's something also to pay attention to. Now, if that is what you start to notice, Sometimes merely having the awareness of like, oh, I had no idea I was doing that, much like the previous one that I was just talking about, is that sometimes all that you need to do is think about, all right, pelvis, we're going to stay quiet. Let's move the leg bone up, pay attention to the rotation here, and then place the foot. Now that might not be enough. So that then what you might need to do is you might need to scoot around, come up with legs up the wall. And as you move that ankle, as you lift that leg off the wall, that pelvis is staying quiet. And as you rotate the leg bone and bring the foot down toward the knee, again, that pelvis is staying quiet. So you're learning how to build that neuromuscular communication between your brain and your tissue so that you start to retrain the pattern that's really going to be helpful for you to not have the pain that you're experiencing. Okay, now sometimes the issue is maybe further up the chain. So then, in that case, something that you can play with is taking your legs over a bolster. Then you can bring yourself down over the bolster. And then you can start to do a variety of things with your arms, right? And maybe this position settles all of the increasing strain at your back or your hips. It might not, but it might, right? And so you can play with just noticing if that's the case. Sometimes an extra bolster is needed. Sometimes placing the legs in the chair or the legs against the wall. The idea is finding the position, discovering the position for yourself of where the legs feel the most comfortable coming into your pelvis, where you can cultivate that comfort and allow the start of an easeful experience and a little less tension, okay? So then from here, once you're in this position and it feels like it's okay, it feels like it's better, then you can do things like bringing the arms over your head, right? And then you can notice, you know what? When my arms come over my head, my ribs start to lift up. Now, one of the little mistakes that people often make is that they then, I shouldn't do that. So I'm going to hold my ribs down and then overutilize these upper abdominal muscles. And in that braced way, they now are starting to bring their arms over their head. But now we've just put a whole bunch of tension into the system and aren't really helping at all the neuromuscular patterning between your brain and the tissue. We're just helping improve the pattern of tension and not between the ribs and the pelvis and the legs. Or if this is where your pain pattern is between your shoulders and your back or your shoulders and your hip, then you're not improving that relationship at all. You've just put this bridge of bracing in between them, yeah? You can also do the same thing. You've seen me do this with index finger and thumb tip, elbows bent and slowly bringing those legs, those are arms, bringing those arms wide. And while you're doing it, what's key is that it's not that you're doing an exercise per se, and it's like, okay, I'm going to do this exercise with my arms, or I'm going to do my arms overhead, and that's going to get rid of my pain. You really need to be taking this idea of, let me see and feel the relationships between this part of my body and how my legs and my pelvis and how my pelvis was moving, right? Because you're collecting what I call data points, and you're starting to recognize what's contributing. Because when you've got persistent pain that's unresolved, or you're doing an exercise and you've started to notice that your pain's increasing, there's so likely, again, something that's in your level of unawareness and you can't solve anything there. So you have to step back and kind of go, okay, what's actually contributing to this in my own movement, in my own compensation patterns, in my own patterns of bracing, in my own tendencies and habits. And I know, I get it. Like sometimes that is just brutal to be facing. I totally get it. And when we can hold ourselves gently and just start to notice what's connecting, you're then going to become clear on what the reality is. And now you don't need to argue with reality because you know it, right? And so then you can actually make a bit more of a solving, because if you're now noticing that you do a whole bunch of holding in through here in order to do movement, that might be one of the things that's contributing to why your hip starts to feel the way it does, or why your hip moves the way it does, right? So you're gathering all of this data so you can see more of the pattern. And when you know the pattern, now you can intervene so much more successfully. Now you can maybe come back into the previous movement that maybe started, or at least open the door to the mechanical inefficiencies you were experiencing. And now you can come back and explore it further. Because if your relationship is between your shoulders, your rib cage, and your hip, and you've now just discovered and freed up some stuff, then you can come back into this movement utilizing the TheraBand, and you can actually start to get a feel for, did something shift? Did something important or did something effective shift? So now you can bring your leg up. You can notice, was there something easier here? Did my foot press less? Was there just an overall experience more ease here? And then here comes the band, and now it's like, okay, can I actually do this now? Can this leg bone actually move without all this other stuff? Okay, so those are a few ideas. I'm going to show you a few more that you can play with. Because the thing is I hope you're getting the appreciation of, like, there's not like a fix, right? Like there's not like a template of, oh, my leg bone's not moving, so do this. It really is, and I can't see you, right? So I'm just talking into the ether of this and saying, here is where you need to start kind of poking around, where you can start exploring, and chances are you know your body better than I do. And some of this is going to be landing of like, yeah, I am going to so do that. I get that relationship. And others of it you're going to think, oh my gosh, I am not going to do that, which is perfect because it tells me that you're paying close enough attention to what resonates with you and what doesn't. And that's like a key step on the way to resolving and solving your pain puzzle. Okay. So here's a couple others that I want you to play with. Sometimes the reason why this tension in the hip is there, and what I mean by tension is that when you're doing this exercise of figure 4 with the TheraBand, it's not working. Sometimes it can be what's going on through the belly. Now, this might seem sort of strange to do, but if you just come into this area of your hip, I'm going to come up to standing a bit here so you can see it, into kneeling. If you come here right into the front of your hip, and just with your fingers, just kind of feel around in the hip. And don't dig in like just be really gentle. And then follow up diagonally toward your breastbone. And you might feel like you're on your back doing this. You might feel some areas of tension or some interesting areas of grip that maybe you weren't aware of. Right? And you can even start to just let your fingers move through your belly and just notice what it is that you feel, all the while being sure that you're actually breathing. Yeah? So you're noticing and feeling here just your breath as you do the movement. Notice if your shoulders want to get involved, and then just get a sense of what's going on in your abdomen here. Easy breathing. And sometimes, because cosmetically, many people will hold their belly in and then they hold their breath. And that can create tension and inefficiencies in the pelvic floor and in and around the pelvis, which can contribute to a leg not moving. Yeah. And just kind of play around in there and get a feel. Okay? And now what you might want to play with from here is taking that ankle onto the knee. And maybe before even trying the TheraBand, just notice if that leg bone can move into rotation. And just notice that experience. Yeah? Notice if you want to brace with the other foot, or if you want to brace through here, or if you want to use your chest, or your jaw, or your neck. Good. And then bring it on down. Okay, now, here's some other things that you can play with. These can sometimes be a little more complex, meaning if you're finding that when you're here and you've got the TheraBand and you're pressing and more tension is building in your back, these sometimes don't work. So you really need to pay attention if what I'm about to say resonates with you, and just don't do it if you're thinking, okay, no way, that's crazy. I'm not going to do that. So then do it, okay? But you can start with just a basic butterfly, right? So this looks like Baddha Konasana, but the feet are not sliding in. The feet are staying wide. and then bringing the legs back up. Okay, so now from here, watch the hip flexors. Allow the movement to be just a rotational movement, and then they come back up. Now you might have full range of motion like this, but when you come back up, your hip flexors may be gripping like crazy to bring yourself back up. Your hip flexors, remember, are muscles that bring your knee to your belly, right? Those are not the ones that bring your back together. Yes, you are in 90 degree, I get that, but they don't have to be involved as primary movers to bring your legs back together. So see if you can only move as far as those hip flexors are soft, and you might just blow your mind in terms of how you feel through your back. Not all of you, but some of you certainly can have that experience because your hip flexors have been controlling so much of your movement. Have the range, but remember, just because you have the range doesn't mean that it's an efficient range, doesn't mean that you're absorbing and dissipating load really well. Good. And then where you can play is just to start to slide that leg away from you and then bring it back up again. Now that might create something through the back of your head or your neck. So if that's the case, then you can take the bolster and you can move the bolster underneath your leg and only go as far as the bolster. And again, sure, you might have the range of motion, but it's not about the range of motion. Just because you have a bigger range of motion doesn't mean you're going to get yourself out of pain. That's not correlated. What is correlated is moving better and compensating less. Now, when you go away, your hip flexor isn't needed. Watch the other side if you're bracing with the other leg. And then as you come back, yes, this is hip flexion. Your hip flexor will be happening. Now, what you could then do is rotation and then bring the leg wide and then up. Rotation and then bring the leg wide and then up. You notice I've left the bolster here, right? This side, watch that you don't press with the foot. Watch that you don't brace with the pelvis. But you're just paying really close attention to what's going on through your leg and your pelvis, your rib cage and your breath. And yes, I know, I've said it before, we're going to move the bolster over, is that this kind of awareness is not for everybody, but I can tell you this, those people who grow their awareness, not only do they get out of pain faster, but so many other areas of their life improve too. So then start to just move that leg down and then back up. Because that's the thing about awareness, and the thing too about pain is what I have found over and over again are when people have pain, and they come to see me at this point that their life is so constricted that they feel trapped and in a cage. And then they start to become aware of some of the contributing factors inside of themselves. And then they start to see how that bubbles over to other areas of their life. And so then the feeling of being trapped and caged just completely changes. Good. And then the leg comes wide. And then their life just gallops away on them in a really positive way. So in fact, the pain that brought them to me actually opened the door of better movement and then just so much more. Good? Okay, so there we go. Those are a number of different things you can play with. Now, we're just going to do a final little test here. See what happens. Now, let's see what happens when you bring that ankle up onto the knee. And notice how you moved, and then notice what happens as you add the tension of the strap. Good, and see how that changed the movement of your leg bone and your pelvis. And then other side, let's try that. And then notice if you're still wanting to push with the opposite foot, back it off if you are. Really try to reduce your habitual compensatory patterns and see what happens. Yeah, I know. Your movement's going to be a lot smaller. I totally get that. And I know that that could be a knocking to your ego. But know this. And I really, really, really want to drive this point home. The fact that you have the range of motion tells me you've got the potential. But right now, if you are busting through with compensation patterns, then you're not actually utilizing the potential the way you could. So if you do that initial oh my God, are you serious? That's my range of motion. If you stay within that range, then the range will grow. And people will often say, but how does that happen? Well, because you're not using compensatory patterns anymore. You're not borrowing from one area in order to get a movement done. That one other area can do its thing that it was designed to do. So now you can work on the tissue that is meant to be doing the job that you want it to do. And then what happens quite naturally is that tissue changes and you start to progress. So give that a go, see how you feel with doing that. After I post this to the feed, we're going to post the link to solving your pain puzzle. If you want to dig into this more, you can join me for a week where I'm going to be digging in and working with you to help you solve your pain puzzle. If you don't want to join me in a group setting and you would rather work with me privately, I do have a spot available starting this month. So if you would like to join me for a private session of a private series, then I would love more than anything in the world to help you solve your pain puzzle. Okay? You have a great, great, great day. We will see you tomorrow morning. All right? Take good care.